Well, it's good to see everybody. I wanted to tell you that this is my first visit to the United Kingdom, and as a philosopher, I've concluded that if you have a British accent, you sound 20% smarter. So I'm at a disadvantage. I'm going to have to make my arguments really good. My talk is entitled Clear Reasons Christianity Makes Sense, and I'm going to get right into it because we have a lot of material we want to cover. And so we live at a time in which there are lots of people who have questions about the truth of Christianity. And I think that we should engage the skeptics. And they can ask us very good questions. And one of those questions is, what rational basis do you have to believe that God, the Christian God in this context, really exists? And what I'm going to attempt to do with you in this talk is to reason abductively. I don't know how many of you are familiar, but there are three ways of reasoning in logic. You can reason deductively, where you attempt to draw certain conclusions. That's often in the area of geometry. It's in the area of formal logic. Or there's induction, where you attempt to reason based upon probability. Much of scientific reasoning is inductive by nature. You try to draw the conclusion that is highly likely. A third way of reasoning, which is probably less well known, is called abductive reasoning, or inference to the best explanation. And it's where you move from facts or data or events to a coherent, plausible explanation. And that's what I'm going to do with you. I'm going to use the word clear, C-L-E-A-R, as kind of a mnemonic device, a memory device, a way of thinking about how we reason for the truth of the Christian God. And so the C stands for cosmos, the L for life, the E for ethics, A for abstractions. Those are things that you can't see, numbers, propositions, the laws of logic, etc. And then R, religion, particularly the life of Jesus. Now you may be asking yourself, well, who reasons abductively? Why should I take this as a good form of reasoning? I would tell you I think that this is the most normal and natural way in which people reason about things. Detectives do it. We watch these programs on television, CSI, the crime scene investigator. They go onto the crime scene. They collect data, and they attempt to draw a theory about what best explains that crime scene. Historians do it. They look at facts and draw explanations. Scientists look at data and develop hypotheses. Physicians, diagnosis is drawn from the symptoms. So anybody who is a diagnostician, including my father who was an automobile mechanic, he could listen to a car engine and tell you what was wrong with it, because he was diagnosing the problem based upon what he had observed and what he had learned. So this is a very normal and natural way in which people reason, and we can reason this way about our faith. And that's how I'm going to do it. So the material that I'm going to present, they can be individual, distinct arguments for God, for the Christian God. However, the material can also represent what we call a cumulative case of evidence on behalf of affirming God's evidence. Lawyers often appeal to a cumulative case. They say it's not one piece of evidence that convicts this person of the crime, but it's the cumulative case. And so I'm going to attempt to do that with you. So while each individual argument has a certain logical or evidential force of its own, taken collectively, the arguments have an ever-increasing and probative force in favor of the existence of God. And so let's be clear. I don't think you have to throw your mind away to be a Christian. I think that faith involves knowledge and is compatible with reason, and Christianity's greatest thinkers have always reasoned that way. The mind is a good thing. It's given by God, and we should use it to the glory of God. So let's talk about this idea of the best explanation of reality. What I'm maintaining is that the most meaningful things in life, like the universe, like our lives, like the moral values that we hold dear, logic and mathematics and religion, that these profound realities need an explanation. And I believe that all of them point to God. And in particular, I think that they point best to the God of the Bible. And so I'm, again, using the word clear as an acrostic or a mnemonic device. And I'm offering this to you as you talk about your faith and as you reason about your faith. So let's start with the C, cosmos. I believe that the cosmos points to God, and the way I think that it does, in that it had a singular beginning. That is extremely biblical. That it has order and elegance and complex fine-tuning. So let's explore a few of those things. It was the German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Leibniz who asked the ultimate, I think, metaphysical question. He said, why is there something rather than nothing? You know, I've thought about that myself. Wouldn't it be more natural if nothing existed? But something does exist. The universe exists. And that singular beginning is worthy of our consideration. Consider the words of the esteemed cosmologists, both British, by the way, Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose, about the singular beginning of the universe. Both of these men are critical of religion, very skeptical, but they've said, quote, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. A beginning? The universe had a singular beginning, matter, energy, space, and time came into existence. How did that happen? What is the best explanation for a universe that has a beginning? Is it reasonable to say that it had a cause? Could we conclude that it came from nothing, by nothing? Is that the way life works? Is that the way the world works? According to the prevailing scientific view of cosmology, the space-time matter-energy universe had a distinct and singular beginning about 14 billion years ago. And of course, cosmology has described this as the Big Bang. Some Christians are a bit uncomfortable with the Big Bang cosmology. I know that some of my young earth friends are a bit troubled by the idea, but I would propose to you that the Big Bang is troubling to naturalists. That the universe had a beginning, that it came out of nothing is troubling for people who think that the universe is all there is. And I would draw your attention to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The heavens and the earth is an ancient expression which means the totality of all things. There's only one religious holy book that seems consistent with the Big Bang. Creation ex nihilo is the doctrine that God called all things that existed into being. Listen to these quotations by leading astrophysicists John Barrow and Joseph Silk when they state the following concerning the Big Bang. They say, quote, our new picture is more akin to the traditional metaphysical picture of creation out of nothing, for it predicts a definite beginning to events in time, indeed a definite beginning to time itself. When they say traditional metaphysical picture, they mean Christian theism. They mean a biblical perspective. That the Big Bang seems to be amazingly compatible with the way Christians thought about creation. Here's an agnostic, another British scholar, Anthony Kenny, very sharp philosopher. He has said, quote, a proponent of the Big Bang theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that matter came from nothing by nothing. What I'm proposing to you here is that the Big Bang is a serious challenge to the naturalist worldview, because you would have to propose that it came from nothing by nothing. But does that seem reasonable? Is that the way we reason? Do we reason in other areas of science that way? Do we say that things just pop into existence without a sufficient cause? I don't think so. So let's put this into an argument. An argument is really a very simple thing in logic. To have an argument, you have to have two things. You must make a claim, and then you must provide support for the claim. The claim is called a conclusion. The support are called the premises. So let's put it into a simple argument. Our first two statements are premises. Our third is the conclusion. Premise number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being. Does that seem reasonable? Do you think the opposite is more reasonable than that? Whatever begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being. Premise number two, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause for its coming into being. Now ask yourself the question, is this more plausible or reasonable than its denials? And if you were to deny one of these two premises, do you really have confidence in denying? Do you think things pop into existence without a cause? Do you have any reason to believe the universe didn't have a cause? I think this is more plausible and viable and reasonable than its denial, and therefore it's acceptable. Take a look at this photo, the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. This is a photograph of the early expanding universe. Those things that I don't know if British people throw around frisbees. They look like, maybe that's an American word. I noticed that when British folk talk about taking a vacation, they say, I'm taking a holiday. And I think, well, in America, holiday is what you do at Christmas or Easter. It's a vacation. So I don't know if my words mean the same thing. Take a look at this photograph. If you ever wondered if God could answer your prayer, God created all of those things. Some of those things are galaxies. So when you pray tonight, you have a deep need. If God can bring everything into existence out of nothing, He has no problems answering your prayers. The universe is before us like a metaphorical book. Well, let's talk a bit more about the cosmos. Let's talk about its order and its elegance. Still, we're looking at that word clear, the letter C, cosmos. Eminent physicist Paul Davies comments on the order and elegance of the cosmos. He says, quote, all science proceeds on the assumption that nature is ordered in a rational and intelligible way. You couldn't be a scientist if you thought the universe was a meaningless jumble of odds and ends. Davies continues, he says, quote, when physicists probe to a deep level of a subatomic structure, or astronomers extend their reach of their instruments, they expect to encounter elegant mathematical order, and so far this faith has been justified. Why is the universe ordered? Why is it that my science colleagues talk about this elegant universe? Why did Einstein say that the language of the universe is written in mathematics? Do any of you ever think about mathematics apart from a mind? When people engage in mathematics, I almost think that's the height of a mental activity. But to be a naturalist, you'd have to argue that these mathematical laws have no mind. They don't come from a mind. Physicist Freeman Dyson, an American, he made this statement relating to the fine-tuning of the universe, and I want you to look carefully at what he says here. He says, quote, as we look out into the universe and identify the many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked together for our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe must in some sense have known that we were coming. Wow. A universe that seems to be just right for the emergence of intelligent beings. Dyson is a skeptic, but he says that it seems like if we had this control board, it seems that somebody has turned all the dials to allow for the emergence of thoughtful, rational human beings. Now, how do we explain this order? How do we explain this elegance? Paul Davies again says that the contingent nature of the cosmos, he says, quote, it seems then that the physical universe does not have to be the way it is. It could have been otherwise. So we could live in a jumbled universe. We wouldn't be living there, but the universe could be jumbled. It didn't have to be this way. So a hospitable to human life universe was not necessitated by the laws of physics. It could have been very different. And if it were different, we wouldn't be here to experience it. The eminent physicist Roger Penrose has calculated the chance formulation of our fine-tuned universe at 1 part in 10 to the 123. Now, I took very little math in college, but I know improbability when I see it. And what we see here is by Davies and Penrose, the universe didn't have to be the way it is. And it's so incredibly improbable that we are really driven to the conclusion that it must have been designed. So let's put it into a form of an argument. The first two premises, this is a syllogism in logic. That's where you have two premises followed by the conclusion. Here's the argument from fine-tuning. And again, ask yourself, could I deny one of those? Would I be would I be reasonable and plausible in denying either of the premises? Premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due either to physical necessity, chance, or design. That's the only three options. It either had to be that way, or we just got lucky, or there's a cosmic designer. Premise number 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance. Davies says it didn't have to be that way. The scientific community concludes it didn't have to be that way. Penrose, I think, has proven how improbable it would have happened by chance. Conclusion, therefore, it's due to design. Now, if you're not comfortable with that argument, if you'd like to reject the argument, then ask yourself, is this argument more plausible and reasonable than its denials? Does it have explanatory power? I think arguing for God is reasonable. It's the normal, natural way, like detectives, like lawyers, like doctors reason. Now, some people have said, well, wait a second, maybe there's a way out of all of this. Maybe this isn't the only universe. Maybe this is one bubble universe that popped into existence, but maybe there's a whole load of universes, maybe near an infinite number. This is called the multiverse or the many worlds hypothesis. So our universe is caused by another universe, which is caused by another universe. Well, I think there are a lot of problems with that theory. Let me simply enumerate them for you. Number 1, it's empirically unverifiable. Nobody has seen any evidence that these universes exist, and it may be that no one ever will. Number 2, it seems to violate Occam's razor. Remember Occam, the medieval Christian philosopher, British, by the way, again? He said that the simplest, fully orbed explanation is the best. It would seem to me that one universe with one God would be simpler than a near infinite number of universes, and atheists are very fond of Occam's razor. 3, it seems like an infinite regression. I mean, what if I said to you, well, who created the universe? And you said God did. And I said, well, who created God? You said, well, God squared created God, who created the universe. Well, who created God squared? Well, God cubed. The problem with that type of reasoning is if there isn't somebody who creates but is uncreated, then the process can never begin. So just the infinite regression problem of the multiverse is you just push it back one. It doesn't really solve anything. Number 4, when physicists say that there are these meta-laws that are beyond the universe, that sounds like metaphysics. Physicists aren't supposed to be metaphysicians. 5, many advocates of the universe have said that any expanding universe had to have a cause. Vilenkin is one of them. If the universe is expanding, it had to have a cause. And then finally, if verifiable, the biblical God may be the best explanation of the universe. My colleagues have pointed out that the Bible teaches that God created another realm. There is a realm, according to Scripture, where beings exist called angels. So it is possible that God has created more than what we could see. So if there is a multiverse, that would need an explanation, and God would likely be the best explanation of that. So I don't think the many worlds hypothesis dodges the problem of God. Well, let's leave C and go to L in the word clear, life. How about human consciousness? How about free agency? How about existential meaning in our life? It seems that human consciousness and free agency and meaning in life fit better in a Christian theistic worldview. From a theistic perspective, God possesses an infinite mind, ultimate freedom, and he defines the very nature of meaning and reality. That is, if God exists, he is a mind. And if he were to create other creatures, the fact that they would have a mind would be normal and natural. But from a naturalist point of view, if you're a naturalist and you're an atheist here, you would have to conclude that the non-rational, the non-personal, the non-conscious somehow became conscious and rational and personal. And I would again ask you from an abductive point of view, does that seem more reasonable than reason causing reason, personhood causing personhood. The naturalist worldview seems to fit better with things like physicalism, materialism, determinism, and nihilism, and it seems that those ideas really undermine the idea of minds and choices and meaningful personal experience. Here is St. Augustine. Augustine, of course, is one of the great Christian thinkers. He said, quote, "Man is one of your creatures, Lord, and his instinct is to praise you. The thought of you stirs him so deeply that he cannot be content unless he praises you, because you made us for yourself, and our hearts find no peace until they rest in you." You know, why is it that people are looking for meaning and purpose and significance? Why do we need hope? Why is it that humans seem to be looking and searching for something that will give their life hope? I wonder, for people who are seriously mentally ill, would they be healed? Would they be helped? Would they be cured if they had a philosophy of life that taught them that God loved them, that God forgave them? What does guilt do to the human psyche? Augustine says that humans are created by God, and they're restless and they're discontent until they find their peace with God. I'm not surprised that when people feel there's no hope in life, they have this existential angst. This painting, The Scream by Edvard Munch, recently sold for $120 million. But I want to give you the philosophical background to this painting. Munch is painting, and this person who is experiencing the angst, the anxiety, it's because nature is whispering in his ear, there's no meaning to life. No meaning to life. I told the group this morning that Viktor Frankl, the famous psychiatrist and philosopher, he was a German Jew. He was arrested in Germany by the Nazis. His wife, his family were put into Auschwitz. His wife was murdered, so were his parents. He said that in order to feel normal, he began to psychoanalyzing the guards and the other people in the camp, just so he could feel like he was a doctor and like he had an everyday life. And because the Jews were being systematically starved, he said when people gave up hope, they'd fall over dead. Hope that the Allies would rescue them. Hope that their wife was still alive. Hope that God would rescue them. What is it about our lives where we crave meaning and purpose in existence? And if you're an atheist, I would say you're going to die. You're going to die soon. You're going to die alone. You're going to be dead forever. If Darwinian naturalism is true, there's no meaning to life. There's no objective morality. There's no life after death. That's a very difficult pill to swallow. But what is it about human beings that we care so much about hope and purpose? Christianity says if you're discontented, if you're restless, if you're searching, it's because God made you and you'll never find rest without Him. Well, let's talk about the E, C-L-E, ethics. I think ethics point to God. Ethics, we're talking about prescriptive, objective morality. We talk about things like ethical duty and human value. Objective morality is valid and binding, independent of human opinion and perspective. For example, murdering innocent people for the fun of it is always wrong. We don't have to be taught that. We know that's true. Even people who engage in murder know it's true. They hide. They run away. Not simply because of fear of punishment, but because they know what they've done is wrong. So how do we explain objective morality? What does it mean for morality to be objective, to be independent of us? Christian philosopher Bill Craig says this. He says, quote, "If God exists, objective moral values exist. To say there are objective moral values is to say that something is right or wrong independently of whether anybody believes it to be so." Craig continues. He said it is to say, for example, the Nazi anti-Semitism was morally wrong, even though the Nazis who carried out the Holocaust thought it was good. And it would still be wrong even if the Nazis had won World War II. That's objective morality. that there are moral principles built into the very nature of reality, and that they're independent of us, and that we conform our behavior to those moral principles. Well, how do we explain them? Well, what if the Nazis had won the war? Yesterday I visited the Churchill War Room and went down into the bunker. What would have happened if Great Britain and the United States and the Soviet Union had not been victorious? Would have ushered in a new dark age? What would have happened? I mean, 60 to 70 million people died in the war. 6 million Jews were exterminated. How do we know that that is wrong without some standard to make judgments? So objective ethical obligations and duties fit better in a theistic worldview. In a purely naturalist worldview, objective morality seems ungrounded, unaccounted for, unjustified, out of place, even foreign. How can there be moral principles if we came from a non-rational, non-personal, non-moral source? How can you justify morality? But most atheists I know, they believe in objective morality. They think it's wrong to murder innocent people for the fun of it, but how do we explain it? Well, here's an atheist, philosopher J.L. Mackie, taught at Oxford. Notice what Mackie says. He says, quote, "Moral properties constitute so odd a cluster of properties and relations that they're most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them." That's a strange thing for an atheist to say. That if Mackie is telling us if there are objective moral principles, then they probably come from God. Unfortunately, Mackie said, I can't believe in God, and therefore I can't believe in objective morality. How do you condemn the Holocaust without objective morality? Atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie argued that morality was merely invented by human beings and was therefore descriptive and subjective in nature. But if it's descriptive and subjective, instead of prescriptive and objective, then there's no way to make moral judgments in life. But our life is filled with moral choices. If God does not exist and human beings are merely highly evolved animals, then it's extremely difficult to see why what the Nazis did in the Holocaust against the Jews was morally wrong in any objective case. How is it any different from the mass extermination of an animal species? I think the naturalist worldview has a hard time explaining these realities. Atheists raise the problem of evil as an objection to believing in God, but without God, how do they account for the moral goodness that evil violates? Do atheists have a problem of the good? In order to have evil, you must have good, because evil is the violation of the good. But where does the good come from? Dostoevsky said, without God, all things are permissible. But that's not a world we want to live in. We don't want to live at Auschwitz. We believe that what the Nazis did was wrong. And my parents and probably your parents or grandparents fought against that because they thought it was wrong. Let's put it into an argument. Premise number one, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise number two, objective moral values and duties do exist. We think what Hitler did to the Jews was wrong. Therefore, the conclusion is God exists. Now, is that argument more plausible and reasonable than its denial? Do you think there are objective moral principles into the world? And how would you explain them without God? That's the nature of the argument. It seems plausible. It seems reasonable. CLE, now the A, abstractions. What are abstractions? These are the invisible things of life. They're invisible and we can't touch them, but they're critically important to us. They're things like numbers and propositions, the laws of logic. They're universal principles. These are the things in the world that make the world meaningful and intelligible, but you can't see them or touch them. Non-physical entities. I once debated a scientist on a program who was an atheist, and he said, I have no beliefs. And I said, really? You don't believe you can trust logic and mathematics? You don't believe there's a real world out there? You don't believe that your cognitive faculties and your sensory organs give you the ability to trace that intelligibility in the universe? But of course, if that's the case, if science is built upon math and logic, how can you trust math and logic if your brain evolved by pure chance? This is, of course, the question that C.S. Lewis asked. It's called the argument from reason. Some of the most important and wondrous realities of life cannot be detected by the human senses. These abstract, intangible realities are conceptual in nature and consist of such things as numbers, propositions, sets, properties, the laws of logic, and universals. In order to have a viable worldview, you've got to be able to explain the physical world, but you've also got to explain the conceptual world. Again, Einstein said that the language of the universe is written in mathematics. Listen to what Alvin Plantinga says. He's one of the leading American philosophers and a Christian. He says, quote, "It seems plausible to think of numbers as dependent upon or even constituted by intellectual activity, but there are too many of them to arise as a result of human intellectual activity. We should therefore think of them as the concepts of an unlimited mind, a divine mind." So how is it, why is it, how do we explain that mathematics are principles that correspond to the physical universe? How could Einstein come up with the theory of relativity? And that relativity theory was tested, and it matched the way the universe is. If God exists, and we're created in His image, and He created the universe, then He networked the universe with us into Himself, then all of this makes sense. I guess we're asking the question, how do you make sense of sense? And how do you make sense of logic and mathematics and abstractions without God? Abstract entities are considered by many to be objective, to be universal and invisible. Again, science, in order to carry out its enterprise, has to be objective, it has to be tested. These abstractions don't appear to be physical in nature, nor are they readily reducible or explainable in terms of physical matter and processes. Where do we get these ideas? My favorite number is number 9, by the way. I think I listened to too many Beatle albums growing up. That was my problem. How do we explain numbers? Abstract entities fit better in a theistic worldview than in a naturalistic one. In the Christian worldview, conceptual realities flow from an infinite mind, the mind of God. It's very difficult to conceive of how abstractions could arise from a worldview of physicalism and materialism. How can non-physical entities come from purely physical material entities? Again, naturalists talk about emerging properties. But how is that an explanation? Most of the naturalist philosophers I know talk about the intractable problem of consciousness. CLEAR. How do we explain the meaningful phenomenon of religion? Our sense of the divine, our religious experiences, things like miracles. And more importantly than all of that, how do we explain Jesus Christ? His unique claims, character, and credentials. Jesus changed the world. How do we account for that? Let's take a look here. Scripture reveals that human beings at their core know that there's a God. I think Romans 1 is giving us some inside scoop about human psychology. It tells us that God created humans in His expressed image, and they have a built-in awareness of the Creator. That's what Scripture tells us. If people do, in fact, possess an awareness of God, then humankind's universal religiosity is explained. And I think that this religiosity runs throughout human beings. Most people are religious. And even some of the atheists I've known Even though they don't believe in God, or they don't believe in a personal God, or they have doubts about a personal God, they still look for meaning and purpose in life. They still look to fill up their life in a way that gives it meaning and significance. And so it seems that religion runs through humanity. How is that best explained? Well, here's a quote from John Calvin, the reformer. Calvin said this. He says, quote, "There is within the human mind, and indeed by natural instinct and awareness of divinity, this we take to be beyond controversy. To prevent anyone from taking refuge in the pretense of ignorance, God himself has implanted in all men a certain understanding of his divine majesty." Well, Calvin's doing nothing but quoting the Apostle Paul. And if God exists, and if he created you and I and everybody else in his image, then it would appear that people's religiosity would be normal and natural. But let me ask you this question. If you're an atheist today, if you're a naturalist, why is it that so many of us have false positives? Why is it that so many of us believe things that are not true? Lawrence Krauss, the famous atheist, and Michael Shermer, the famous skeptic, they've said the reason why people like you and I believe in things like life after death and God's existence and objective morality is evolution has created those thoughts in our mind in order to advance our species. That is, there were survival advantages in believing in those things. And my question is simply this: well, then evolution has caused us to believe things that are false. Why should I then trust evolution? How can evolution be a correct mechanism if it's led us to things that are false? That seems to me to be a potential defeater for the naturalist worldview. Now, of course, there are people who raise questions about Jesus. Some would suggest, for example, that how do I know? How do I know I can take the Bible at face value? How do I know that the Bible hasn't been deeply changed? How do I know that Jesus even existed? Is there any evidence outside the Bible? Don't quote the Bible to me to prove the Bible. Well, let me share with you briefly that here are 10 non-Christian historians and politicians and writers who wrote about Jesus near the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century. Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, Pliny the Younger, the Jewish Talmud, the Toledo Thiesu, Lucian, Thales, Mara Barsarpian, Phlegon, all of these people in one way or another wrote about Jesus. Some of them were Jewish, some were Greeks, some were Romans. None of them met Jesus. None of them saw Jesus risen from the dead. But this is what they say about Jesus. This is what they were hearing. This is what they detected at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. Here is their portrait of Jesus. Number one, that he was a provocative teacher, a wise and virtuous man from Judea. 2, that he reportedly performed miracles and made prophetic claims. They never saw these miracles, but these are the things they heard from people who had told them. 3, that Jewish leaders condemned Jesus for acts of sorcery and apostasy. 4th, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now, let me ask you this. Does any of that seem inconsistent with what you know of the New Testament? Now again, none of these Jews or Romans, Greeks, none of them saw Jesus or knew Jesus, but this is what they were hearing. And what they were hearing, at least thus far, seems quite consistent with what we find in the New Testament. They also said that Jesus' followers, called Christians, reported that he had risen from the dead. 6, that the Christian faith had spread to Rome, where Christians were charged with crimes and met horrific persecution. And then finally, that 1st century Christians worshiped Jesus as God. I would say that none of this is inconsistent with what's taught in the New Testament, and that this serves as a level of corroboration of the truth of the New Testament. that Jesus' historicity is confirmed by people who were not his followers. Again, they didn't see Jesus risen from the dead. This is not proof that Christianity is true, but I think it provides a powerful historical corroboration that these people living at that time encountered things and learned things that are consistent with what the New Testament says. Let's look at Jesus in a bit more detail. He equated himself with Yahweh. He took the most sacred of divine titles, I am, and he applied it to himself. So sometimes people will say, well, how do you know Jesus ever claimed to be God? Well, in the book of Isaiah, chapters 44 through 48, God has a special name for himself. According to Isaiah the prophet, God likes to be called I am or I am he. And this is that sacred name, and the Jews were very careful about pronouncing that name. They didn't want to say the name Yahweh because they were afraid they may misuse it, so sometimes they would choose another word, Adonai, Lord, in order to safeguard it. But everybody knew that God's personal name was I am or I am he. Of course, we arrive in John chapter 8, verses 58 and 59, and we read these words. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. At this, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. Why did they pick up stones? Because Jesus was reaching into the Old Testament and taking the most sacred name of God Almighty and putting it as on his own lips. Jesus said many things. I and the Father are one. Here's an Eastern church icon of Jesus. According to the non-Christians, the Christian church worshiped Jesus as God. In fact, to say Jesus is Lord, Iesus Kurios in the Greek, Jesus is Lord, that word Kurios is the Greek word that was transferred for Yahweh. So for Christians to say Jesus is Lord, Romans 10:9, it means he's the ruler, he's king, he's God. And if he's Lord, Caesar isn't. Jesus exhibited, according to the New Testament, matchless moral character. Even the world's greatest philosophers and religious leaders, like Socrates, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, Confucius, and Moses, pale in comparison to him. I mean, isn't there something that we all know about ourselves? That we know that we're imperfect? We try to hide our faults from each other, but if you talk to my wife, she'll fill you in. And all of these other religious leaders that I've studied, they had deep moral flaws. But the people who were around Jesus the most, the apostles, they said, he doesn't sin. He doesn't have moral faults. Well, I would say that is a foundational reason for thinking he's so different than us. And that's part of his claims. That's part of his character. He fulfilled dozens of very specific Old Testament prophecies concerning the identity, mission, and message of the coming Messiah. Look at the Old Testament. Look at the prophecies that are made. These prophecies that were written hundreds of years before Jesus' birth, they give very precise details concerning the birth, heritage, life, death of the long-awaited Messiah. That you can test that. You can test it. And some of our non-believing friends, they're looking for evidence. They're looking for things that they can verify. Christians say Jesus fulfilled these prophecies. Look at the Old Testament and compare them. According to the New Testament, Jesus was a prolific miracle worker. He healed incurable diseases, restored sight to the blind, multiplied food, calmed storms, walked on water, and even raised the dead. And the peculiar thing in the New Testament is that none of Jesus' enemies ever questioned the authenticity of these acts. What did they say? He does it from the power of the devil. The power of the devil. What about the resurrection? There's evidence for the resurrection. The empty tomb. If you can show Jesus' body, you falsify Christianity. Christianity is theoretically falsifiable. Post-crucifixion appearances, transformation of the apostles, conversion of the Apostle Paul. Could I propose to you that what Paul's conversion is so extraordinary, what would it be, what would the contemporary example be? Would it be Churchill becoming a Nazi? Would it be Ronald Reagan becoming a communist? Would it be Adolf Hitler becoming a Jew? What changed him? Or better yet, what changed James? James, the brother of Jesus, if I put it in the contemporary way, James thought his brother was a bipolar. He thought his brother was seriously mentally ill. And then in Acts 15, he becomes one of the greatest proponents of the Christian faith. Why? How do you go from believing your brother is mentally ill to believing him to be the Son of God? I think those things need explanations. I also think the emergence of the church, and I think we need explanation for why Sunday became significant. Jews never worshiped on Sunday. Sundown Friday to sundown Saturday were the Sabbath. There's no reason for Christians to worship on Sunday except for the resurrection. So one of the strongest evidences that the Christian theism's truth claims are correct is their ability to account for and justify the many diverse and undeniable realities of life. The Christian faith involves knowledge, and it's uniquely compatible with reason. All of these points, clear, are in my new book. And I want to encourage you to take this material, make it meaningful to you, think it through in your own minds, and begin to engage with non-Christians. Do we have time for question and answer? And so how much time do we have here?
What's the time on the clock at the moment?
It looks like it's 12:48.
Okay. So we've got 10 to 15 minutes of time for Q&A.
Great.
We've got a microphone down here, and we've got a microphone up in the balcony. So if we do one question down here, followed by a question in the balcony, and keep going in that order, that would be great. So who would like to ask a question, first of all, on the ground floor? Okay.
Does music fit into your clear plan there, and if so, where?
Yes, I think that the whole issue of aesthetics, beauty, art, music, all of those elements are these non-physical parts of our being that need some adequate explanation. Why is it that human beings create music and art? Why is it that we feel these are such necessary parts of our existence? And then I ask the question, what's the best explanatory theory? If God created us, if God cares about beauty, if music reflects truth, then it seems that these are very meaningful elements. And if they come from a naturalistic point of view, why do we care so much about beauty? Why do we care about music and art? I think, again, yes, those kinds of things could also be weaved into these meaningful realities of life that we hold so important, and how do we explain them? The Christian church has always believed in art and music. Obviously, they've been critical of art that we think is inappropriate, but yes, that's exactly what I mean. How do we explain these meaningful realities? I would propose that theism has a better explanation. Yeah. How about upstairs here? Yes.
Regarding the historical Jesus, there are some atheist historians that would say that the writings of Josephus may be fraudulent in some aspects. How would you answer that?
It is true that some have proposed that Josephus, that maybe people have come along later and kind of colored up Josephus's comments. Some people think that maybe they were a bit embellished. Maybe it was religious people, maybe it were Christians who came along and tried to make it look a little more clear or a little more certain in that type of context. I would say two things to that. I would say, number one, Josephus is only one of 10 who write about the existence of Jesus. And secondly, that even if we go back to what we believe is probably what Josephus wrote without any embellishment, he's still referencing the person of Christ. So I don't think that that is a serious detraction. We could set aside Josephus and still have a number of non-Christian authors who write about him. And there is a way of looking at probably what Josephus wrote without embellishment that still seems to support the historical existence of Jesus. So I don't think that they've made a very convincing case. Down here.
When we come back to the question of Jesus and the issue I discussed with my youth group at church, and there's a particular question that I still analyze every time, and it's, given the expanse of the universe and the mightiness of God and things you've said, why was there a need for Jesus to die? That's the thing, because obviously God is awesome, God is great. I understand the theological arguments, but I want to see from your point of view, why is there a need for death? Coming from how big the universe is, and yet one person he had to come to a specific place to die before redemption could be accomplished. Why is death such a necessity?
Yeah. I appreciate your question. And again, what I want all of you to appreciate is here is a Christian raising questions about Christianity. That's a good thing. I wish non-Christians could hear the fact that believers raise questions about their faith. We scrutinize our faith. We have questions about our faith, and that's a good thing. Well, let me again kind of unpackage the gospel. We're creatures that possess moral responsibility. To be a sinner, according to the New Testament, hamartia is the Greek New Testament word for sin. It means to miss the mark. It means to break the commandments. Sin is to exercise our rebellion and independence from God. And this is something that is very serious to God, obviously. And atonement has to combine, I think, two fundamental things: love and justice. I mean, if Jesus comes into the world, the early Christians argued that Jesus had to be both God and man. The Greeks called it the theanthropos, theos, God, anthropos, man. He had to be the theanthropos, the God-man, because he had to be able to reconcile both parties. He had to be able to speak for both parties. Now, the question of death. Well, how is it that God somehow can lay his wrath, his just indignation against Jesus? Why the crucifixion? I again would say that the Christian message derived from the scriptures, reflected in Christian theology, is that there must be this exchange, that God's justice must be satisfied. And yet he allows the sinner to escape. And so there is this love and this justice. And what do we have in other religions? Christianity, you have God who takes on human form. He appears on the stage of human history. And the death is that sin costs something. God is serious about sin. So serious that he allowed the Son of God, who took a human nature, to be publicly crucified. And maybe the reason for crucifixion is, here's this Roman Empire that claims to be the rulers on earth. And Jesus comes in the midst of that kingdom, lays down his life as a sacrifice. Maybe there is a kingdom clash in all of that. But to answer your question as directly as I can, because God is very serious about human sin and rebellion. And that's why Christians should be very serious about confession and repentance and living lives that are gratitude to the Almighty. Do we have time for one more question? Are we up now? Over here.
Hi, just following on from what that guy asked. If God is omniscient and omnipresent, then when he started the world, he would have known that humans would have rebelled against him and that he would have had to send his son in order to save us. So why did he start the world if he knew we'd do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the conclusions are correct. If God is omniscient, if he knows all things, if he's everywhere present, if he's all-powerful, then obviously he knows all of these things. He is in control of these things. Why would he do it? I think I would say to that because he desired to have creatures like us. That is, from eternity, he decided that he would create, he would allow people to rebel and fall, and he determined that the best thing in any possible world is for his son to come and lay down his life and express love in a way that no one could ever fully comprehend. So imagine if God didn't do it. Is a world without sin where Jesus doesn't die, is that a better world than a world in which there is sin and the Son of God comes and dies for us? I would propose it might be neater and cleaner if God didn't allow any of that to happen, but I don't think that a world without the death of the Son of God could ever be better. So if you're asking what's the better worldview, I think a world in which we receive Jesus and his love, even with all of the fallenness and brokenness, that is the best of all possible worlds. By the way, I'd also say this: why did God create us in his image? Because from eternity, he always planned to become one of us. He made us in his image because down the line, the Son of God was going to take our form. And so being made in his image facilitated the doctrine of the incarnation. Christian theology logically unfolds. The Trinity makes the incarnation possible. The incarnation makes the atonement possible. I would argue that a world, even a fallen world, even a broken world, even with all of the sorrow in this world, this is still a better world because Jesus appeared and died on the cross for our sins. That would be my answer. I think we're one more, and I think we're down here.
When you were talking about our natural religious bent, you mentioned that evolution could be argued, put it there. Why would we trust something that deceived us? But a postmodernist would argue that the question there is not, is it true, but did it work? If a religious bent, for example, enabled altruism and enabled the species, therefore, to look after one another better, that worked in the same way that my parents, when I was smaller, would have told me things that weren't actually true, but kept me safe from running into danger. How would you answer that one?
I appreciate that question. I think that we do now live at a time where people probably do ask slightly different questions. They ask questions about workability rather than ultimate truth. My response, however, would be, does the theory of general relativity work, or is it true? Are mathematical principles workable, but are they workable because they're true? And so I would argue that, yeah, evolution may have caused these beliefs that are false in order to give me survival advantages, but in order to know that evolution is true, I have to be able to have the capacity to determine truth. So the naturalist is giving a worldview. They've got to defend their worldview. To say it works is not enough. To know that their worldview is right, I have to be able to trust the reliability and truth of my mind. I think this argument is a potential defeater for naturalism and secularism, and I haven't heard a good answer from them yet. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.